And speaking of ideas, this can lead us to the third part of our session, where we're going to be looking at the ideas, the guidelines, the paradigms, the tools that we might need to come together as a community to go forward. And we're going to begin by exploring the concept of Earth spirituality with a video greeting from Mary Evelyn Tucker from the Yale Forum of Religion and Ecology. Sorry, let me share my screen.
The world's religions are beginning to contribute to the environmental movement in a variety of ways. Of course, in academia, we have this field of religion and ecology at Yale, but across the country in many universities. The next generation is really getting the idea that we need to retrieve, reevaluate, and reconstruct these traditions for our environmental challenges. But one of the most exciting areas, which is what Interfaith Power and Light is so critical for, is the religious grassroots environmental movement. So we like to say this is the force of religion and ecology, the field and the force, the theory and the praxis. What an amazing combination, because as we bring these traditions out of their theological and ethical constraints to speak not just to human-human relations or human-divine relations, but human-earth relations, this sensibility is already being displayed in a variety of ways. Interfaith Power and Light has been doing this work of carbon footprint reduction, of advocacy in government, and so on. But if we take this around the world, there are many groups doing this. And on the Forum on Religion and Ecology, each of the traditions listed there, the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the Asian traditions of Hinduism and Jainism, Buddhism and Taoism, and even Shinto, all of these traditions have grassroots projects, or we call them engaged projects. And you can look this up on our website, fore.yale.edu. If I give just a few examples, in the Middle East, one of the most exciting collaborative projects is Friends of the Earth Middle East, working together on the Jordan River on water issues there. If you take India, you have tree planting going on in some of the Hindu temples. You have water conservation issues, especially regarding the glacier melt in the north of India and so on. Tree planting around the world is critical. Buddhist monks in Southeast Asia have been ordaining trees to protect them and preserve them. Of course, Wangari Maathai, who combined her Christian and her African roots in Kenya, created one of the most robust movements that we have, the Greenbelt movement, especially of women planting trees. So all of the areas that are critical to our environment, water, trees and forests, certainly fisheries and food. These are areas that religions are beginning to move into ever more deeply, to say food is sacred, how we grow it is sacred. So the invitation then is to continue this robust, growing, and very efficacious environmental movement with the religious voices and the religious projects. Thank you.
And it is now my great pleasure to invite my dear colleague from the Laudato Research Institute here at Campion Hall, Peter Rožič, who is the director of the Integral Ecology Research Network here at the LSRI. Welcome, Peter. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Mariana. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
We are basically in the same building. But...
Literally upstairs. I'll let you speak.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Father Josh. Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful conference. It's so nice to see familiar faces and meet new ones, and to talk about these really important issues, and to think about what a movement is and how ambitious we can and could and have been with regards to moving along and ahead and forward. Now, movements actually can be a bit tricky. Movements we have seen in the past, in the history, have lost direction. They can generate tremendous energy, but that energy can be spent for not always very good things. So I'd like to begin with with a simple image. If a people's movement is to endure, it needs a compass. Not first a strategy, although I love strategizing. Not first a project, although I love project management. Certainly not first another document. It needs a compass. A compass does not tell us every step we should take. It helps us remain oriented, even when the terrain changes. You know, if a few of you were in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or elsewhere, you kind of have to move with the terrain and it changes, but the compass doesn't, right? It helps you find orientation, stay on track. For me, that is one of the gifts of integral ecology. Integral ecology is often described as a framework or a vision, and I think both are true. But I increasingly find myself thinking of it as a compass. It helps us recognize what matters most when circumstances become uncertain or complex. That compass points, I suggest, in 4 directions. How about that? You know, like north, south, east, west. So let's begin with the first, a relationship. Laudato Si reminds us that nothing exists in isolation. Ecological, social, cultural, economic, and spiritual realities belong together. The ecological crisis is therefore not only about climate or biodiversity. It is about the quality of our relationships with one another, with the creation, and with God. So that was the first, relationships. The second direction is justice. Pope Francis reminds us that the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor are one cry, as we have heard today already. That means ecological action cannot be separated from questions of poverty, exclusion, inequality, dignity. We cannot heal ecosystems while ignoring those whose lives depend most directly upon them. All right, so that was the second one, justice. The third direction I propose is participation. People's movements are not built by experts alone. They grow when communities become protagonists of their own future. Indigenous people, farmers, young people, women, men, religious communities, scientists, policymakers, local leaders. All these and others bring knowledge that no single institution possesses on its own. Integral ecology invites us to listen before we prescribe. So that was the third one. And now the fourth direction, I think, is hope. Yeah, hope. Now, hope is often misunderstood as optimism. Of course, they are close. But I think hope is something quieter. Hope is the decision to continue cultivating life, even when outcomes remain uncertain. It is what one of the Jesuit missionaries to Africa that developed systems of rice intensification, Henri de Laulanier, he embodied this when he began simply by observing, asking questions, and trying. He said, you just have to try it. And I think that's the basis of any movement. You try. It is what so many communities around the world continue to do today. Over the past few years, for example, myself, I have had the privilege of working with colleagues across Africa and other continents through the Integral Ecology Research Network. Again and again, I have seen that ecological transformation really begins with large-scale programs. It begins with practice, action, because that's what defines us. So someone experiments, someone observes, someone learns, others join. Communities of practice emerge, and learning is shared. Only gradually do institutions begin to support what has already taken root. Perhaps that is another way of thinking about people's movement, not as something we launch, but as something we cultivate. The role of institutions is important, of course. Universities and churches and schools and networks and religious congregations and movements and hospitals and so on. Their task is not simply to produce knowledge. It is to create conditions in which learning and relationships and practical wisdom can continue to grow. That, I believe, is one of the most important challenges before us. Not only to protect creation, but to become communities capable of living differently together. So perhaps the question we leave with today is not simply how do we build a people's movement, but rather, what kind of people are we becoming? Because if our relationships are transformed, our institutions will gradually change with them. And if our institutions learn to sustain that transformation, then care for our common home will no longer be an aspiration. It will become a way of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think this compass of relationship, justice, participation, and hope is a really incredible way of looking at things. It really resonates with what our other speakers were saying about a hope that isn't wishful thinking, as Lorna was saying before. So I really encourage all participants to really think about how they can apply this gentle hope, this observation, and this just continuously going in your own contexts. And feel free to share it in the chat. What are your fears and how are you going to implement this hope and hopefully this compass that Peter has just offered to us. I would now like to move on to Francis Gustilo, my Ferreros from the Don Bosco School of Theology of Manila, to talk about the concept of Theoecology. Francis and May, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. A bit of history. Way back in 2023 only did we start to think about what a small school of theology here in Manila with only about 90 students can actually offer to participate in this movement of ecology, of integral ecology. Why 2023? Because as I get the word from Father Peter, compass, we were celebrating 40 years of establishment. And I thought that 2033, 10 years, 10-year work and strategizing and programming and working into action is necessary. And 2033 happens to be the 2000th anniversary of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Why cannot a school of theology, in its competence of theologizing, assist many other schools, not only of theology, but Catholic schools in the Philippines, to help regenerate as a form of resurrection, regenerate the planet, so that young people who are now only 10 years old, when they get to 20 years old in 2033, will have a fighting chance to really help and make a better planet. Therefore, theology is, ecology first is to be aware of the what's happening really. And then theology is, why should we get involved? What's the moral dimension of this? Why are we obliged? But we are Don Bosco, so for us, technical technology. How can we already offer certain very good green solutions to urban communities, since we belong to a city, and how to make the environment a better place? I'd like to share with you Ms. May Ferreros, who guided us in these 3 years since 2023 to 7 runs of the Theoecological School. We call it Laudato Si Certified Environmental Trainer course. Ms. May.
Thank you, Father Francis. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. I'd like to share what we have accomplished for the past 3 years. No? So Don Bosco School of Theology contributes to this care for our common home movement through a concrete and replicable model, and that is the Laudato Si Certified Environmental Trainer course, or what we call LS-CHET. Over the past 3 years, this is not theory. It is documented, on the ground, network of faith-based ecological actions across the Philippines. From 2023 to 2026, the LS-CHET trainers implemented 43 ecological and environmental initiatives across schools, dioceses, hospitals, parishes, faith communities, and civic organizations, directly engaging at least 197 trainers, leaders, educators, and institutional representatives, and indirectly reaching thousands more students, parishioners, healthcare workers, and community members. That is the scale of a people's movement. Not one parish, one school, or one diocese, but an interconnected web of institutions converted to ecological stewardship through a shared formation process. So how does this work? The LS-CHET is not a seminar that ends with just an attendance. In order to be certified, participants are required to put into learning one of the 3 concrete tracks. One is applied learning programs, or the participants re-echoes the Laudato Si and Theoecology framework in their own communities. The second is materials recovery facility, where they personally build or revive, so that they will have the discipline of proper waste segregation. And lastly, technology integration projects, where we taught them some technologies like hydroponics, biochar, composting, coastal cleanups, and some outreaches like tree planting activities. Every claim is verified and documented through site inspection, and every trainer closes with a personal reflection. This is what makes the program transformational rather than informational. Conversion is demonstrated, not just professed. To give you some concrete impact stories, I will just cite a few of those who have been certified. St. Paul's de Chartres, Our Lady of Peace in Antipolo, was able to cut collection of waste from 243 kilograms to 75 kilograms in a single month to their effective MRF use and composting. The Canosa San Pablo College reduced waste segregation by half and doubled their recyclable sales when they rehabilitated their MRF. The Feast Makati Mandaluyong was able to turn their junkyard into greenhouses and now supporting 1,500 hydroponics lettuce seedlings. The Diocese of Antipolo was able to mobilize 500 students for cleanup and tree planting. The Benedictine nuns of the Eucharistic King was able to build an MRF, have a composting system, an herb garden, and even repurpose their old microphone as wires and fencing. The St. Paul Hospital strengthened ecological healthcare waste systems. This is a proof that this movement reaches beyond schools and into health and civic sectors. So what makes the LS-CHET distinct is a people's movement is our compass, the spiritual core. One of our trainer who is attending right now, who is a survivor of the Typhoon Yolanda, or internationally known as Haiyan, described his certification not as a finish line, but as a sending forth. We are not just certified, we are commissioned. The trainers of this program consistently describe the course as a pilgrimage of the soul that taught them that creation is sacred and that loving God cannot be separated from loving his creation. This is the cultural shift that this conference is calling for. Ecological action rooted in conviction, not compliance. So to close, in the 3 years that the Ellis Chip has shown that a single theological small school like us can seed a movement. 43 initiatives, almost 200 trained leaders, and thousands reached across schools, hospitals, dioceses, and parishes. Don Bosco School of Theology offers this not as a success story, but as a reproducible model for a common home. One where we can hope that we can scale alongside the other movements represented in this panel toward genuinely creating a people's movement for the care of our common homes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, May and Father Francis, for this really inspiring example. We're getting close to the end of our session, so as you start thinking about the questions that you want to ask our speakers or the reflections that you want to share in the chat, I would like to invite our final speaker for today, Vinta Nanda, filmmaker based in Mumbai, to speak about what does cultural transformation look like. Vinta, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Mariana. I'm really grateful to Father Josh for organizing this very eclectic and a very important conference. Also, Steve Allen and Jackie Miller for getting me involved with this community. I'm so glad I'm here. It is an honor to be a part of this conversation inspired by Laudato Si, which reminds us that caring for Earth is not only an environmental responsibility, but a profoundly human one. When we speak about climate change, we often speak in the language of science, economics, or policy. We measure temperatures, emissions, and biodiversity loss. These conversations are essential, but cultural transformation begins somewhere else. It begins in the human heart. Every great movement in history was first imagined before it was organized. It began with a story that changed the way people saw themselves and the world around them. As a filmmaker, writer, and founder of the JDEI and the Waterfront Indie Film Festival in Mumbai, I have spent my life believing that stories are not entertainment alone. Stories shape memory, they shape identity, and ultimately they shape behavior. Today, our greatest crisis is not only ecological, it is also a crisis of imagination. We know the facts, we have heard the warnings, yet we continue to live as though the future belongs to someone else. Perhaps what is missing is emotional connection. When a glacier melts, it is a statistic. When a farmer loses hope, it becomes a story. When a child grows up believing that climate catastrophe is inevitable, it becomes a question of mental health. Climate anxiety and emotional well-being are deeply intertwined. Young people across the world are carrying the weight of a future they did not create. They need more than data. They need hope. They need communities. They need stories that remind them that change is still possible. They need to know that every action, however small, contributes to a larger movement for change. And that is where culture matters. Long before we wrote environmental policies, we sang the earth into our children's hearts. Nursery rhymes, folk tales, and legends taught us to cherish rivers, forests, and the changing seasons. In India, from Amrita Devi in 1730, incidentally, this is a story that actually inspired the Chipko movement. In 1730, there was a Bishnoi community which was saving its forests from a king of that time who wanted to build a palace there. So Amrita Devi was the first life that was lost because she hugged the tree and refused to move from there, and she was killed. But the community came together and they all went and embraced every tree that was there in the forest. Of course, there was a lot of loss of life. But by the time the king heard what was happening, he came around and promised the community that he would not destroy the forest and a palace will never be built there. So from Amrita Devi in 1730, who gave her life embracing a kejri tree, to the women of the Chipko movement in more recent times, who wrapped their arms around trees of a forest to protect them, Our stories remind us that the nature was never a resource to be exploited, but a companion to be protected. Every generation has its stories. Yesterday they were nursery rhymes and folklore. Today they are films, songs, documentaries, and digital media. The medium has changed. The responsibility has not. Culture has always shaped the way we see the world, not by commanding us, but by stirring our imagination. Yet, even as climate change enters our homes through floods, droughts, and disappearing livelihoods, we pursue success, power, and wealth as though caring for the earth is a distraction. It is perhaps the greatest irony of our age. We have forgotten a simple truth. Humanity cannot flourish if earth does not. Our stories must help us remember it once again. We have forgotten that there can be no lasting prosperity on a dying planet. Our stories must help us remember what our ancestors instinctively understood, that humanity flourishes only when the earth flourishes, because the earth is not merely where we live. It is the source of every life, every livelihood, and every future we hope to build. Cinema, literature, theater, music, and journalism have always been more than artistic expressions. They are spaces where societies examine themselves. They invite us to feel before they ask us to act. Culture has a unique ability to transform spectators into participants. This conviction has shaped our work through the Dahlia and the Waterfront Indie Film Festival. We see every film, every conversation, every article, and every workshop as an opportunity to nurture not just artists, but citizens, people who recognize that creativity carries responsibility. We must encourage young storytellers to become witnesses to our times, not witnesses who merely record crisis, but witnesses who illuminate possibility. The environmental movement cannot be sustained by legislation alone. It also requires songs that people remember, films that move audiences, books that stay with us long after we close them, conversations that cross generations, and communities built around compassion rather than fear. If we want people's movement for our common home, then every storyteller must become a storyteller for the earth, not necessarily by making films about forests or oceans, but by creating stories that restore our relationship with nature, remind us of our shared humanity, and awaken the responsibility that has always lived within us. Culture teaches empathy. Empathy becomes responsibility. Responsibility becomes action. And action, repeated by millions of ordinary people, becomes transformation. The question before us is not whether culture can change the world. History has already answered that. The real question is whether we are willing to use our creative gifts in service of something much larger than ourselves. I believe we are, because every meaningful change begins with a single voice that refuses to remain silent. Let us tell stories that children will one day sing as nursery rhymes. Let us create films that remind us where we belong. Let us leave behind a culture that values not only what we own, but what we protect. Because if culture can shape humanity, then humanity can still choose to protect our common home. Thank you.
Vinata, thank you so much for this beautiful reflection on the huge power of art. I think we can all agree that art and culture are the one thing that really gives us human connection in an age that is increasingly about technological connection. So let's keep that human connection and connection within our environment as well, within that human connection. Thank you so much.